How to extract info, secrets, and truth. Make people reveal their true thoughts and intentions without them even knowing it. Written by Patrick King, narrated by Russell Newton. Being a better communicator is one thing, but when you think about it, so much of what we say to one another is far beyond the verbal language we share intentionally. If you want to become better at reading people and understand them on a deeper level, it's necessary to go one step deeper than what we normally think of as communication. In the chapters that follow, we're going to explore several subtle but effective ways to quietly gather information about the people around us, even and especially when they're not deliberately sharing it. We'll look at the power of observation, how to master questioning techniques to your advantage, and see what we can learn from interrogators, interviewers, and even cold readers and psychics. But first, we'll start with something simple, merely looking at what's right in front of you. If you really look, there's a lot of information to be gleaned about the people you interact with. The idea that people cannot help but reveal their true intentions and feelings one way or another is an appealing one. People can say whatever they like, but it's always been understood that actions speak louder than words, and that people's facial expressions or body language can inadvertently reveal their deepest selves. We are, in effect, communicating all the time, sending out information about our intentions and feelings, but only a small fraction of this is verbal. Observing people's actions and behavior in real time is what we most commonly understand to be analyzing people. It might seem natural to look to people's physical bodies in space to intuit what's going on in their heads, and there's plenty of scientific evidence to support these claims. Physical appearance can tell you a lot about a person's feelings, motivations, and fears, even if they're actively trying to conceal these. In other words, the body doesn't lie. Nevertheless, this approach to understanding people's motivations is not foolproof. When we're interacting with others and trying to understand what makes them tick, it's important to be cautious in making assumptions. We're all individuals, and context is very important. Though we can use various methods to read facial expressions and body language, it pays to remember that no single piece of information is enough to prove anything, and that the art of reading people this way comes down to taking a holistic view of the full scenario as it unfolds in front of you. Look at my face. Let's begin with Haggard and Isaacs in the 1960s. They filmed couples' faces during therapy and noticed little expressions that could only be caught when the film was slowed down. Later on, Paul Ekman expanded on his own theory on microexpressions and published a book, Telling Lies. We all know how to read macro expressions, those facial movements that last up to 4 seconds in duration. But there are quicker, more fleeting expressions that are so fast they could easily be missed by the untrained eye. According to Ekman, facial expressions are actually physiological reactions. These expressions occur even when you're not around anyone who could see them. He found that across cultures, people used microexpressions to display their emotions on their faces in very predictable ways, even when they were attempting to conceal them, or even when they themselves were unaware of the emotion. His research led him to believe that microexpressions are spontaneous, tiny contractions of certain muscle groups that are predictably related to emotions and are the same in all people, regardless of upbringing, background, or cultural expectation. They can be as quick as 1/30th of a second long, but catching them and understanding what they mean is a way to cut through what is merely said to get to the deeper truth of what people feel and believe. Macro expressions can be, to some extent, forced or exaggerated, but micro expressions are understood to be more genuine and difficult to fake, or else suggestive of concealed or rapidly changing emotions. Within the brain, there are 2 neural pathways related to facial expressions. The first is the pyramidal tract, responsible for voluntary expressions, i.e., most macro expressions, and the extrapyramidal tract, responsible for involuntary emotional facial expressions, i.e., micro expressions. Researchers have discovered that individuals who experience intense emotional situations, but also external pressure to control or hide that expression, will show activity in both these brain pathways. This suggests that they're working against one another, with the more conscious and voluntary expressions dominating the involuntary ones. Nevertheless, some tiny expressions of the real emotion may leak out. This is what you're looking for when you attempt to read a person in this way. So, just how exactly does one learn to read these expressions? Can you really decode a person's deepest feelings just by looking at a twitch of their nose or a wrinkle in their brow? According to Ekman, there are 6 universal human emotions, all with corresponding minuscule facial expressions. Happiness is seen in lifted cheeks, with the corners of the mouth raised up and back. Wrinkles appear under the eyes, between the upper lip and nose, and in the outside corner of the eyes. In other words, the movements we're all familiar with in an ordinary smile are there on a micro level too. Micro expressions suggesting sadness are also what you'd expect. The outer corner of the eyes droops down, along with the corners of the lips. The lower lip may even tremble. Eyebrows may form a telltale triangle shape. For the emotion of disgust, the upper lip lifts and may be accompanied by wrinkles above it and wrinkles on the forehead. The eyes may narrow slightly as the cheeks are raised. For anger, eyebrows lower and tense up, often at a downward angle. Eyes tighten too, and the lips may be pursed or held stiffly open. The eyes are staring and piercing. Fear, on the other hand, entails similar contractions, but upward. Whether open or closed, the mouth is tense, and both upper and lower eyelids are lifted. Finally, surprise or shock will show itself in elevated brows, rounded rather than triangular, like with sadness. The upper eyelids lift up, and the lower eyelids stretch downward, opening the eyes wide. Sometimes the jaw can hang loosely open. As you can see, microexpressions are not very different from macroexpressions in the muscles that are involved. The main difference is in their speed. Ekman demonstrated, however, that these quick flashes of muscle contraction are so fast that people miss them. 99% of people were unable to perceive them. Nevertheless, he also claims that people can be trained to look for microexpressions and, in particular, learn to detect liars, a classic example of saying one thing and feeling another. Ekman claims to be able to teach his technique within 32 hours, but for those of us who are curious about using the principles in our own lives, it's easy to start. Firstly, look for discrepancies between what is said and what is actually demonstrated through facial expressions. For example, someone might be assuring you verbally and making promises, but showing quick expressions of fear that betray their real position. Other classic indicators that you're being lied to include lifting the shoulders slightly while someone is vehemently confirming the truth of what they're saying, scratching the nose, moving the head to the side, avoiding eye contact, uncertainty in speaking, and general fidgeting also indicate someone's internal reality is not exactly lining up with the external, i.e., they might be lying. Again, it's worth mentioning here that this is not a foolproof method, and that research has mostly failed to find a strong relationship between body language, facial expression, and deceitfulness. No single gesture alone indicates anything. Many psychologists have since pointed out that discrepancies in microexpressions can actually indicate discomfort, nervousness, stress, or tension without deception being involved. Nevertheless, when used as a tool along with other tools, and when taken in context, microexpression analysis can be powerful. Granted, you'll need to stare quite intently at the person and observe them in a way that's uncomfortable and too obvious for normal social situations. You'll also have to weed out tons of irrelevant data and decide what gestures count as noise or meaningless idiosyncrasies. At any rate, people who lack the required training have been shown to be astoundingly bad at spotting liars, despite feeling as though their gut intuitions about others' deceit is reliable. This means that even a slight increase in accuracy you might gain from understanding and implementing the microexpression theory may make all the difference. A microexpression may be small, but it's still a data point. All this talk of unmasking liars may make this technique seem rather combative and underhanded, but Ekman is careful to point out that lies and deceit, as he frames them, can also indicate the hiding of an emotion, and not necessarily any malicious intent. There is certainly an allure in playing detective and uncovering people's secret feelings, but in reality, the use of micro-expression analysis is a bit like CSI. It always looks a bit more impressive on TV than it is in real life. Furthermore, the goal in developing the skill of micro-expression analysis is not to play gotcha to our friends and colleagues, but rather to enhance our own empathy and emotional intelligence and foster a richer understanding of the people around us. If you're not convinced about using microexpressions to detect deception, another perspective is not to look for lies or classify expressions according to their duration, but rather to look at what an expression typically conveys. Then, depending on context and how the expression compares to what's said verbally, you can come to your own conclusions. Nervousness is typically behind things like tightening the lips or twitching the corners of the mouth very quickly toward the ear and back. Quivering lips or chin, a furrowed brow, narrowed eyes, and pulled-in lips may also indicate the person is feeling tense. If a person you know is normally calm and composed, but you suddenly notice plenty of these little signs while they tell you a tale you don't quite believe, you might infer that for some reason they're nervous about telling it to you. Whether this is because they're lying or because their story is simply uncomfortable to tell, only you can decide from context. A person feeling dislike or disagreement might purse their lips tightly, roll their eyes, flutter their eyelids briefly, or crinkle their nose. They may also squint a little or narrow their eyes like a cartoon villain staring down the hero, close their eyes, or sneer a little in a slight expression of disdain. If a person opens the Christmas present you gave them and immediately proceeds to do all of the above, you might want to assume they don't really like their gift, despite what they say to the contrary. Those dealing with stress may find tiny ways to release that stress, giving themselves away, even though for the most part they appear quite calm. Uncontrollable, fast blinking, and making repetitive motions like twitching the cheek, biting the tongue, or touching parts of the face with their fingers can all indicate someone who's finding a particular situation stressful. This might make sense when someone's in a job interview or being questioned in connection with a crime, but may be more noteworthy if you spot it in seemingly calm situations. This discrepancy gives you a clue that all might not be as it appears. Pay attention also to asymmetry in facial expressions. Natural, spontaneous, and genuine expressions of emotion tend to be symmetrical. Forced, fake, or conflicting expressions tend not to be. And again, try to interpret what you see in context and consider the whole person, including other body language. Remember that analyzing facial expressions is a powerful method of understanding others that's more than skin deep, but it's not foolproof. Every observation you make is simply a data point and doesn't prove anything either way. The skill comes in gathering as much data as you can and interpreting the whole emerging pattern before you rather than just one or two signs. For this reason, it's best to use what you know about microexpressions as a supplement to other methods and tools. Body talk. Body language, for instance, may be just as powerful a language to learn to read and comprehend as facial expressions. After all, The face is simply a part of the body. Why focus on just one part when people's postures and general movements can speak just as eloquently? Ex-FBI agent Joe Navarro is generally considered an authority in this field and has used his experience to teach others about the wealth of information people share without ever opening their mouths, i.e., what he calls nonverbal communication. Originally from Cuba, and having to learn English after moving to the U.S. when he was 8 years old, Navarro quickly came to appreciate how the human body was a kind of billboard that advertised what a person was thinking. During his career, he spoke at length about learning to spot people's tells, those little movements that suggest that someone is uncomfortable, hostile, relaxed, or fearful. As with facial expressions, these tells may hint at deceit or lies, but primarily indicate that someone is uncomfortable or that there is a discrepancy between what's felt and what's expressed. Armed with an understanding of how body language works, we can not only open up new channels on which to communicate with others, but pay attention to our own bodies and the messages we may be unwittingly sending to others. Firstly, it's important to understand that nonverbal communication is inbuilt, biological, and the result of evolution. Our emotional responses to certain things are lightning fast, and they happen spontaneously, whether we want them to or not. Importantly, they express themselves physically in the way we hold and move our bodies in space, potentially resulting in the transmission of thousands of nonverbal messages. It's the more primitive, emotional, and perhaps honest part of our brain, the limbic brain, that's responsible for these automatic responses. While the prefrontal cortex, the more intellectual and abstract part, is a little removed from the body and more under conscious control, it's also the part that's capable of lying. But even though a person can say one thing, their bodies will always speak the truth. If you can tune into the gestures, movements, postures, patterns of touching, and even the clothing a person wears, you give yourself a more direct channel into what they really think and feel. Navarro claims that the majority of communication is nonverbal anyway, meaning you're actively missing out on the bulk of the message by not considering body language. Consider that communication started out non-verbally. In our earliest histories, before the development of language, humankind most likely communicated by gestures, simple sounds, and facial expressions. In fact, from the moment a baby is born, it instinctively makes faces to communicate that it's cold, hungry, or frightened. We never need to be taught how to read basic gestures or understand tones of voice. This is because nonverbal communication was our first communication and may still be our preferred form. Think of all the ways you already take nonverbal communication for granted, in the way you show love or demonstrate your anger. Even if you aren't aware of it, we're all still processing vast amounts of information on nonverbal channels. Learn how to read this information, and you can determine if someone is trying to deceive you or perhaps if someone is trying to conceal their feelings and true intentions from you. You've probably heard of the fight or flight response before, but there's a third possibility: freeze. What's more, these responses to danger may be quite subtle, but nevertheless they speak to discomfort and fear. Our ancestors might have shown fight or flight when running from predators or enemy tribes, but those instincts might have followed us into the boardroom or classroom. The limbic brain is again responsible for these fear responses. Someone who's asked a difficult question or put on the spot may look like a deer caught in the headlights. They may lock their legs around a chair and stay fixed tight in that position. This is the freeze response. Another possibility is physically moving the body away from what is perceived as threatening. A person may put an object on their lap or position their limbs toward the exit, the flight response. Finally, a person may fight. This aggressive response to fear can show itself in picking arguments, verbally sparring, or adopting threatening gestures. In fact, the more competent you become at reading nonverbal signals, the more you may come to appreciate how fundamentally physical they are and how much they speak to our shared evolutionary history. In the past, We might have literally fended off an attack with certain gestures, or indeed set out to attack another with very obvious movements and expressions. These days, our world is very abstract, and the things that threaten us are more verbal and conceptual. But the old machinery for expression, fear, aggression, curiosity, etc., is all still there, only perhaps expressed a little more subtly. Let's consider what are called pacifying behaviors. These can offer a key insight into someone who's feeling stressed, unsure, or threatened. Essentially, a pacifying behavior is what it sounds like: the unconscious attempt to self-soothe in the face of some perceived threat. When we feel stressed, our limbic brain may compel us to make little gestures designed to calm us. Touching the forehead, rubbing the neck, fiddling with hair, or wringing the hands are all behaviors intended to soothe stress. The neck is a vulnerable area of the body, but one that is relatively exposed. Consider how aggressive people go for the jugular, and you understand how the throat and neck can be unconsciously felt to be an open area for fatal attack. It makes sense, then, that someone unconsciously covering or stroking this area is expressing their struggle, emotional discomfort, or insecurity. Men may use this gesture more often than women. Men may fidget with their ties or squeeze the top of the neck, while women may put the fingers to the suprasternal notch, the indent between the collarbones, or play nervously with a necklace. Pay attention to this behavior, and you'll notice how it reveals someone's fears and insecurities in real time. Someone might say something a little aggressive, and another person responds by leaning back slightly, crossing the arms, and putting one hand up to the throat. Notice this in real time, and you can infer that this particular statement has aroused some fear and uncertainty. Similarly, rubbing or touching the forehead or temples can signal emotional distress or overwhelm. A quick tap with the fingers may reveal a momentary feeling of stress, whereas a prolonged cradling of the head in both hands can spell extreme distress. In fact, you can consider any cradling, stroking, or rubbing movement as the physical clue of a person's need to self-pacify. This could mean touching cheeks when the person feels nervous or frightened, rubbing or licking the lips, massaging the earlobes, or running the fingers through the hair or beard. Pacifying behaviors are not just things like stroking or rubbing, though. Puffing out the cheeks and exhaling loudly is also a gesture that releases considerable stress. Have you ever noticed how many people will do this after hearing bad news or narrowly escaping an accident? An unexpected stress release response is yawning. Rather than indicating boredom, the body's sudden attempt to draw in more oxygen during stressful times is even seen in other animals. Leg cleansing is another, and it entails wiping down the legs, as though to wash them or brush off dust. This can be missed if it's hidden under a table, but if you can notice it, it's a strong indication of an attempt to self-soothe during stressful moments. Ventilating is another behavior you may not pay much attention to. Notice someone pulling their shirt collar away from their neck or tossing the hair away from the shoulders as though to cool off. They're likely experiencing discomfort or tension. Though this might be literally because of an uncomfortable environment, it's more likely a response to inner tension and stress that needs cooling off. One of the most obvious forms of pacifying behavior looks exactly like what a mother might do to a young child to soothe them. Cradling and hugging one's own body or rubbing the shoulders as though to ward off a chill all suggest a person who feels under threat, worried, or overwhelmed. These gestures are an unconscious way to protect the body. This is an important underlying principle across all of body language theory, that limbs and gestures may signal unconscious attempts to protect and defend the body. When you consider that the torso contains all the body's vital organs, you can understand why the limbic brain has reflex responses to shield this area when threats are perceived, even emotional threats. Someone who's highly unresponsive to a request or who feels attacked or criticized may cross their arms as if to say, "Back off." Raising the arms to the chest during an argument is a classic blocking gesture, almost as if the words being exchanged were literally thrown, causing an unconscious reflex to fend them off. On a similar note, slumping loose arms can indicate defeat, disappointment, or despair. It's as though the body is physically broadcasting the non-physical sentiment of, I can't do this. I don't know what to do. I give up. Let's take it further. Imagine someone standing over a desk, arms spread wide. Aren't you immediately reminded of an animal claiming territory? Wide, expansive gestures signal confidence, assertiveness, and even dominance. If a person is standing with arms akimbo, they leave their torso exposed. This is a powerful way to communicate that they are confident in taking up room and don't feel threatened or unsure in the least. Other gestures of confidence and assertiveness include that favorite of politicians and businessmen the world over, hand steepling. The fingertips are pressed together so they form a little steeple. It's the classic negotiating gesture, signaling confidence, poise, and certainty about your power and position, as though the hands were merely resting and calmly contemplating their next move. On the other hand, pun intended, wringing and rubbing the hands is more likely to demonstrate a lack of feeling in control or doubt in one's own abilities. Again, this is a pacifying gesture designed to release tension. Hands are our tools to effect change in the world and bring about our actions. When we fidget, wring our hands, or clench our fists, we're demonstrating a lack of ease and confidence in our abilities, or find it difficult to act confidently. What about the legs? These are often overlooked since they might be concealed under a desk, but legs and feet are powerful indicators too. Happy feet can bounce and jiggle. On the other hand, bouncy legs paired with nervous or pacifying gestures may indicate an excess of nervous tension and energy or impatience. Or too much coffee. You decide. Toes that point upward can be thought of as smiling feet and indicate positive, optimistic feelings. Physiologically, our legs and feet are all about, unsurprisingly, movement. Busy feet could suggest an unexpressed desire to get moving, either literally or figuratively. It's also been said that feet point in the direction they unconsciously wish to go. Both toes turned toward the conversation partner can signal, I'm here with you. I'm present in this conversation. Whereas feet angled toward an exit could be a clue that the person really would prefer to leave. Other clues that someone is wanting to move, leave, or escape are gestures like clasping the knees, rocking up and down on the balls of the feet, or standing with a bit of a bounce in the step. All of these subtly communicate someone whose unconscious mind has fired up the engines and wants to get going. This could mean they're excited about possibilities and want to get started as soon as possible, or they may have a strong dislike for the current situation and almost literally want to run away. Again, context matters. Legs and feet can also reveal negative emotions. Crossing the legs, as with the arms, can signal a desire to close off or protect the body from a perceived threat or discomfort. Crossed legs are often tilted toward a person we like and trust and away from someone we don't. This is because the legs can be used as a barrier, either warding off or welcoming in someone's presence. Women may dangle shoes off the tips of the toes in flirtatious movements, slipping a shoe on and off the heel again. Without getting too Freudian about it, the display of feet and legs can indicate comfort and even intimacy with someone. On the other hand, locking the feet and ankles can be part of a freeze response when someone really doesn't like a situation or person. So, having discussed the face, hands, legs, and feet, and torso in general, what else is there? Turns out, a lot more. The body as a whole can be positioned in space in certain ways, held in certain postures, or brought further or closer to other people. The next time you meet someone new, lean in to shake their hand, and then watch what they do with their entire body. If they stand their ground and stay where they are, they're demonstrating comfort with the situation, you, and themselves. Taking a step back or turning the entire torso and feet to the side suggests that you may have gotten too close for their comfort. They may even take a step closer, signaling that they're happy with the contact, and may even escalate it further. The general principle is pretty obvious. Bodies expand when they're comfortable, happy, or dominant. They contract when unhappy, fearful, or threatened. Bodies move toward what they like and away from what they don't like. Leaning toward a person can show agreement, comfort, flirtation, ease, and interest. Likewise, crossing the arms, turning away, leaning back, and using tightly crossed legs as a barrier show a person's unconscious attempt to get away from or protect themselves from something unwanted. Those people who spread out on public transport, they feel relaxed, secure, and confident. Annoying, isn't it? Those that seem to bundle themselves as tightly as possible may instead signal low confidence and assertiveness, as though they were always trying to take up less room. Similarly, puffing up the chest and holding out the arms in an aggressive posture communicates, "Look how big I am," in an argument, whereas raising the shoulders and turtling in on oneself is nonverbally saying, "Please don't hurt me, look how small I am." We're not much like gorillas in the forest, beating our chests during heated arguments, but if you look closely, you may still see faint clues to this more primal behavior anyway. Those postures that take up room and expand are all associated with dominance, assertiveness, and authority. Hands on the hips, hands held regally behind the back. Doesn't it make you think of royalty or a dignified soldier who is unafraid of attack? Or even arms laced behind the neck as one leans back in a chair, all signify comfort and dominance. When you're becoming aware of people's body language, ask in the first instance whether their actions, gestures, and postures are constricting or expanding. Is the face open or closed? Are the hands and arms spread wide and held loose and far from the body, or are the limbs kept close and tense? Is the facial expression you're looking at pulled tight or loose and open? Is the chin held high, sign of confidence, or tucked in, sign of uncertainty? Imagine you have no words at all to describe what you're looking at. Just observe. Is the body in front of you relaxed and comfortable in space? Or is there some tightness, tension, and unease in the way the limbs are held? A lot of the art of body language is, once pointed out, rather intuitive. This is because each of us is actually already fluent in its interpretation. It's merely allowing ourselves to de-emphasize the verbal for a moment to take notice of the wealth of nonverbal information that's always flowing between people. None of it is really concealed. Rather, it's a question of opening up to data coming in on a channel we're not taught to pay attention to. Putting it all together, how can we use all of this to actually help us read people effectively and understand even those motivations, intentions, and feelings people may be actively trying to conceal? It's worth remembering right off the bat that detecting deception is not as straightforward as some would have you believe. And as we've seen, not as simple as spotting a telltale sign that proves a lie once and for all. Laypeople and professionals alike are notoriously bad at reading body language, despite the wealth of information we now have on the topic. But the knack really comes in deciding what to do with certain observations once you've made them. Does a person's folded arms mean they're lying, unhappy about something, fearful, or just feeling cold? The trick comes in using not just one or two, but a whole host of clues and tells to form a more comprehensive picture of behavior. The reason why it's so difficult to spot a lie with perfect accuracy is that the gestures and expressions associated with deception are often not different from those signifying stress or discomfort. So, given all this, is it worth learning to read body language? Absolutely. Adding this extra dimension to your interactions with others will only enrich your relationships and give you extra insight into your interpersonal conflicts and tensions. Knowing what's going on with another person allows you to be a better communicator and speak to what people are actually feeling rather than what they're merely saying. Body language signals are always there. Every person is communicating non-verbally at every moment of the day, and it's possible to not only observe this information in real time, but learn to properly synthesize and interpret it. You don't need to be an expert, and you don't need to be perfect. You just need to pay attention and be curious about your fellow human beings in a way you might not have before. As you're developing your body language reading skills, it may help to keep a few key principles in mind. Establish normal behavior. One or two gestures in a conversation don't mean much. They could be accidental or purely physiological. But the more you know how someone normally behaves, the more you can assume that any behavior outside of this is worth looking more closely at. If someone always squints their eyes, pouts, jiggles their feet, or clears their throat, you can more or less discount these gestures. Look for unusual or incongruent behavior. Reading people is about reading patterns of behavior. Pay special attention to clues that are unusual for that person. Suddenly fiddling with the hair and avoiding eye contact could tell you something is going on, especially if this person never does either of these things normally. You may with time come to recognize tells in people closest to you. They may always wrinkle their nose when being dishonest, or clear their throat excessively when they're afraid and pretending not to be. Importantly, pay close attention to those gestures and movements that seem incongruous. Discrepancies between verbal and nonverbal communication can tell you more than merely observing nonverbal communication alone. It's about context. An obvious example is someone wringing their hands, rubbing their temples, and sighing loudly, but who claims, "I'm fine, nothing's wrong." It's not the gestures that tell you this person is concealing distress, but the fact that they're incongruent with the words spoken. Gather plenty of data. As we've seen, certain constricting behaviors could merely be because one is cold, tired, or even ill, and expansive gestures may not be about confidence so much as feeling physically warm and wanting to cool off. This is why it's important to never interpret a gesture alone. Always consider clusters of clues. If you see something, note it, but don't come to any conclusions immediately. Look to see if they do it again. Look for other gestures that may reinforce what you've seen, or else give evidence for the opposite interpretation. Check to see if the behavior repeats itself with other people or in other contexts. Take your time to really analyze the whole of what's in front of you. Look for mirroring. An important thing to remember is that certain gestures may mean one thing in one context or when shown to one person, but have a different meaning in another context or with someone else. In other words, certain gestures could literally only apply to you as you speak to this person. If you're not very familiar with someone, a quick body language reading shortcut is to merely notice whether they are or are not mirroring your gestures, whatever they are. Mirroring is a fundamental human instinct. We tend to match and mimic the behavior and expressions of those we like or agree with, while we don't if we dislike a person or perceive them negatively. If you're in a meeting with a new client, you may notice that no matter how friendly your voice or how often you smile and make open-handed, warm gestures, they respond with coldness and closed gestures, failing to mirror back to you your optimism. Here, the gestures themselves are irrelevant. It's the fact that they're not shared which shows you that the person you're dealing with is unreceptive, hostile, or threatened. Pay attention to energy. This is not some fluffy, esoteric idea. In a group, simply take note of where intention, effort, and focus are being concentrated. Watch where energy flows. Sometimes the leader of a group is only so in name. The real power may lie elsewhere. One only needs to look at how much focus and attention flows toward a baby in the room to see this in action. The baby says and does very little, yet nevertheless commands the attention of everyone there. Similarly, a family may have the father as the official leader, and he may gesture and talk loudly to cement this perception. But pay attention, and you may see that it's his wife who is constantly deferred to, and every member of the family may show, with their body language, that it is in fact their mother's needs that take precedence, despite what's claimed verbally. The most powerful voice in a room is not necessarily the loudest. A lot can be understood about the power dynamics in a group by watching to see where energy flows. Who speaks the most? Who are people always speaking to, and how? Who always seems to take center stage? Remember that body language is dynamic. When we speak, the content of our language isn't just about the words and the grammar we use to string them together. It's about how we talk. Do we say a lot or a little? What tone of voice? Are sentences long and complicated or short and terse? Is everything phrased tentatively like a question, or is it stated confidently as though it's a known fact? What's the speed of delivery? How loud? Is it clear or mumbling? In the same way that nonverbal information can vary in the way it's communicated, nonverbal information can vary too. Gestures are not static, fixed things, but living expressions that move in time and space. Watch the flow of information in real time. Watch how expressions change and move in response to the environment and those in it. Don't be curious about catching a discrete gesture, but rather watch the flow of gestures as they change. For example, look at how a person walks. Walking is like a body posture, but set in motion. Shuffling slow gaits suggest lack of confidence, while springy quick ones suggest optimism and excitement. Become interested in how a person responds to others in conversation or their style of talking to those in positions of power. Once you start looking, you'll be amazed at the wealth of information that's just waiting there to be noticed. Context is everything. Finally, it bears repeating, no gesture occurs in a vacuum. Nonverbal communication needs to be considered in relation to everything else, just like verbal communication. Establish patterns and learn about a person's behavior over time in different contexts and toward different people. Consider the situation and environment. Sweating and stuttering during your wedding vows or a big interview is understandable. Doing so when asked to explain what you're doing snooping through someone's drawers is a little more suspicious. Remember that everyone has their own unique, idiosyncratic personality. Factor into your analysis the fact that people are either introverted or extroverted, may favor emotions or intellect, may have high or low tolerance for risk and adversity, may thrive in stressful situations or wither in them, and may be spontaneous and casual, or goal-directed and rather serious. Our instinctual, evolutionarily programmed impulses can't be hidden or resisted, but they can take on slightly different forms depending on our unique personalities. Admittedly, reading facial expressions and body language is a skill that takes time and patience to master. There are no quick and easy tricks to understanding people's deeper motivations. However, remember the above principles and focus on honing your powers of observation, and you'll soon develop a knack for seeing and understanding even tiny ripples and flutters of behavior you might have previously missed. We live in a world dominated by words and language, but when you become a student of nonverbal communication, it's no exaggeration to say that you open yourself up to an entirely different, sometimes quite strange world. The human body is a whole. Read it that way. Everyone has heard an offhand statistic which sounds a little something like 90% of your communication is really nonverbal. We imagine that communication is primarily a question of language, symbols, noises and sounds, and images on a page, whereas the person creating the language is a separate physical entity occupying space. But in reality, The boundary between verbal and nonverbal, medium and message, is always a little blurred. In the previous sections, we've explicitly considered how a person can be read even beyond the content they're choosing to deliberately convey to you. In other words, you're not just listening to the message they're sending, but listening to them, as though their body itself were something to read and interpret. In the discussion on detecting deceit or hidden true feelings, we made an assumption that what is inside a person will invariably manifest itself somehow on the outside of a person. This is because we instinctively understand that human beings are wholes, i.e., the verbal and nonverbal are really just different aspects of the same thing. What really is the distinction between the words and the lips that say them, the body and the gesture that the body makes? This may seem a little abstract, but it turns out there's now interesting research to back up the idea that communication as a whole can be understood as a complete expression of a human being. First of all, have you ever had a phone call with someone where you could instantly tell whether they were smiling or not? Call center managers will tell their staff that people can hear smiles over the phone. But how do you suppose this is actually possible? It makes sense when we consider that a voice is not an abstract symbol, but a real physiological part of the human body. Researcher at the Donders Institute of Radboud University, Wim Pao, published some interesting findings in the PNAS Journal in 2020. He was interested in the topic we all seem to instinctively understand, that hand gestures and facial expressions can help us better understand what is being communicated. In fact, at times, a gesture can be fundamental to us understanding the message. In an experiment, Pao asked 6 people to make a simple noise, like ah, but to pair it with different arm and hand gestures as they spoke. He then asked 30 other participants to listen to recordings of the sounds only. Surprisingly, the participants were able to guess what the accompanying movements were and even mimic them for themselves. They could say what the movement was, where it was performed, and even how quickly the gesture was made. How? Pao's theory is that people are able to unconsciously detect subtle but important shifts in voice pitch and volume, as well as speed changes that accompany different gestures. When you make a gesture, your whole body gets involved, including your voice. In other words, when you hear a voice, you are hearing multiple aspects about that person's body. When speaking, sound vibrates all through the connective tissues of your body, but differences in muscle tension can arise if we're making gestures with other parts of our body, and we can hear these tiny adjustments in the voice. The great thing about this particular skill is that you don't necessarily need to train it, just become aware of it. You probably never thought you could practice reading body language over the phone, but you can, if you understand that the voice is simply a part of a person's body. Voice alone is an incredibly rich aspect of behavior to study. When you hear someone from another room, on a recording, or over the phone, close your eyes and imagine what their body is doing and what that posture or gesture might indicate. You can undoubtedly hear age and sex through voice too, but you can also infer something about a person's ethnicity or nationality by listening to their accent or vocabulary. Listen to the speed, timbre, volume, pitch, and degree of control used. How's the person breathing? How are their words and the way they're saying those words reinforcing one another, or perhaps undermining one another? For example, someone on the phone might be telling you how excited they are about something, but their slow and sluggish voice may suggest to you that they're slouching and folded in on themselves, and greatly overstating their excitement. Thinking in terms of message clusters. Let's shift our attention away from individual physical actions that may or may not mean or suggest something else, and instead consider human behavior in terms of the overall message it communicates to others. If we're feeling hostile and aggressive, for example, This attitude and intention will show up in every area, from our language to our actions to our facial expressions to our voice. Rather than trying to imagine what every possible manifestation of aggression looks like, we can focus on the aggression itself and watch for resulting clusters of behavior. Aggression is understandably shown by confronting gestures or those that move actively and energetically towards a target. Invasive, approaching gestures that move in on another person can signify an attempt to dominate, control, or attack. Verbally, this could look like an insult or a jeer. Physically, it looks like standing too close, or even displaying or exposing oneself as if to demonstrate superior strength. Aggression is all about sudden, impactful, and targeted gestures. It's as though the entire body is clenched around a single pointed intention. Assertive body language, on the other hand, is as forceful, but not so directed. This is a person standing their ground, i.e., being firm, balanced, smooth, and open in expression of a confidently held desire. The aggressive person may yell, whereas an assertive one may simply state their business with a kind of muscular certainty that can be heard in the voice. Submissive body language is the complement. Look for lowering, self-protective gestures that make the person seem smaller, with small appeasing gestures like smiling excessively, being motionless, speaking quietly, turning the eyes downward, or assuming a vulnerable or non-threatening stance. This is different from being genuinely open and receptive. Relaxed, friendly people will signal looseness, open and uncrossed arms and legs, unguarded facial expressions, easy speech, or even loosening and removing outer layers of clothing to show informality. This is a little like romantic body language, except someone who is sexually interested will also behave in ways that emphasize intimacy. The focus will be on sensuality, touching the person or the self, preening, stroking, slowing down, warm smiles, and connection, prolonged eye contact, questions, agreement, mirroring. The overwhelming perception is that of an invitation to close distance. Deceptive body language is anything that is characterized by a sense of tension. Deceit is the existence of two conflicting things. For example, someone believes one thing but says another. Look for the tension that such a disparity creates. You want to look for anxiety, closed body language, and a sense of distractedness. After all, they are processing extra data they don't want to reveal to you. Look for someone who appears to be trying hard to control themselves with an anxious effect. By looking at intentions behind overall communication, we can start to read the body as a whole. This makes it easier to gather multiple data points more quickly and find patterns of behavior rather than inferring too much from just a single gesture or expression. Consider the entire human body: the limbs, the face, the voice, the posture, the torso, the clothing, the hair, the hands and fingers, everything. Can you see a cluster of closed-off defensive gestures? Is someone trying to display power, strength, and dominance? Or are they just confident? Is the person in front of you trying to show that they're trustworthy, or that they have a truly valuable thing to sell you, salesman's body language, or that they're greeting you with openness and respect? In very general terms, look for the following whole body patterns. Crossing, closing in or shutting off could signal guardedness, suspicion, shyness. Expanding, opening, loosening signals friendliness, comfort, trust, relaxation. Forward, pointed, directed may speak to dominance, control, persuasion. Preening, touching, stroking shows romantic intentions. Striking, abruptness, force, loudness signal energy or violence, sometimes fear. Repeating, agreement, mirroring shows respect, friendliness, admiration, submission. In an even broader sense, look at overall behavior and communication as an expression of holding onto, holding in, holding up, holding back, failing to hold, holding tightly, etc. If you meet someone whose entire being seems to be an expression of force and control, holding onto, you can take your interpretation of them from here and better understand all the smaller data points. The hand-wringing, the tightened and pursed lips, the furrowed brow, the shallow breathing that seems to strangle the voice, the high-pitched tone, the rapid blinking. Their body is sending you one clear, uniform message, one of tension. There's something big going on that they're trying hard to keep under wraps. Further context clues could tell you whether this is an uncomfortable admission, a lie, or simply something they're embarrassed about sharing with you. Wrapping up, how can we read and analyze people just through sight and observation? We've covered two primary aspects, facial expressions and body language. It's important to note that though many aspects have been scientifically proven with physiological origins, we can't say that simple observations are foolproof. It can never be definitive because there are too many external factors to take into account. But we can better understand what typical things to look for and what we can glean from them. We use two types of facial expressions, micro and macro expressions. Macro expressions are larger, slower, and more obvious. They're also routinely faked and consciously created. Micro expressions are the opposite of all those things, incredibly quick, almost unperceivable, and unconscious. Psychologist Paul Ekman identified a host of microexpressions for each of the 6 basic emotions, and, in particular, has also identified microexpressions to indicate nervousness, lying, or deception. Body language has a much broader range of possible interpretations. Generally, a relaxed body takes up space, while an anxious body contracts and wants to conceal and comfort itself. There are too many specifics to list individually, but just keep in mind that the only true way to analyze body language is to first know exactly what someone is like when they're normal, and then compare back to that baseline. To put everything together, we need to read the body as a whole and look for general clusters of behavior that work together to communicate a unified message. The voice can be read like any other body language. Looking for signs or cues that are incongruent and don't mesh well with the other cues they're giving, this might reveal that the other person is trying to hide something, if you can notice other cues that reaffirm this conclusion. However, as always, the signs you've picked up on could well be meaningless, so make sure you have enough data to support them. People who have mastered the art of observation are like detectives, simultaneously gathering as much data as possible that they can then constantly sift through, looking for broad overall patterns that explain the whole picture in front of them. People are complex and constantly shifting and responding to their environment. But if you take the time to pay attention to how they engage with that environment in all ways, you may surprise yourself with what you can learn. In the next chapter, we'll be looking at ways to not just observe behavior, but to actively influence it using the power of targeted questions. Takeaways. It's possible to extract loads of useful information from people merely by using the power of observation. First, observe the face. Tiny, quick, and involuntary movements of the face can leak a person's true emotions. There are 6 universal ones: anger, fear, surprise, disgust, happiness. Look for microexpressions that contradict what is said verbally. Ex-FBI agent Joe Navarro has some tips for reading body language, and they come from an understanding that body language is inbuilt, automatic, and anxious, and based on fight, flight, or freeze response in humans. For example, pacifying behaviors like covering the neck can indicate the person is trying to manage stress. Note how the body is occupying space and whether it is generally closed or open. Posture and gesture can tell you about whether a person is assertive, aggressive, uncertain, or fearful. Bodies expand when they're comfortable, happy, or dominant. They contract when unhappy, fearful, or threatened. Body language signals cannot be interpreted in isolation. Rather, first, seek a baseline of behavior to help interpret a particular new observation. A baseline helps you identify incongruent behavior and spot a deception. Look for mirroring, pay attention to overall energy, and remember that body language is dynamic, so you need to gather as much data as possible. Then, consider this data in context of history and the current environment. The voice is a part of the human body, and speed, timbre, volume, pitch, and degree of control can signify emotional state. The body is a whole with verbal and nonverbal mingling together. Reading message clusters helps us organize isolated observations and note whether they are aggressive, romantic, assertive, deceptive, and so on in aggregate. This has been How to Extract Info, Secrets, and Truth. Make people reveal their true thoughts and intentions without them even knowing it. Written by Patrick King, narrated by Russell Newton. Copyright 2021 by Patrick King. Production copyright by Patrick King.